Hi, we're talking today to Boyd Cohen, a climate strategist, author, and founder of IAMOB, a core mass platform, an open mobility marketplace, as it were. Welcome, Boyd. If anything, this time has proven that experimentation is possible. We've seen, for instance, public-private experiments flourish. In Bogota, there's an example of a bike lending scheme for hospital staff. In your experience, you've experimented within the system from the start with a COVID-resilient mass system. How does that work?
Well, that's a good question. I think historically around the world, our mobility systems have been insufficiently resilient. I think it's in part because we put too much pressure on public transit as being the be-all, end-all. And as you know, depending on where you are in the world, sometimes public transit fails people on a regular basis and clearly cannot be resilient by its nature in many cases. So then we saw over the last decade the emergence of several on-demand types of mobility and shared mobility services to sort of come in and help add resilience to the system. The problem is each of them have been introduced as walled gardens. And what I mean by that is each one has their own app. They're all trying to recruit and own their own users, and they're all disconnected from each other. So to have a truly proper resilient system, you want to welcome all these diverse mobility services in your city and regulate them properly so you don't have this chaos around dockless vehicles parked all over the sidewalks. And then you want them to be seamlessly integrated to each other with a digital layer so that users can easily go from A to B without depending on a car. And when any piece of that whole ecosystem disappears because the electricity goes out in the light rail system or whatever, you have plenty of other services that can fill the gap for people. And ideally, the system is even smart enough so that, particularly for lower income people, but maybe for anyone who relies on public transit on a regular basis, you have mechanisms to support, say, micro subsidies for users in the case of public services being under available due to some kind of crisis that happens. So as a general, to respond in a more shorter way, our mobility systems have not been resilient enough, but we're starting to see the elements of a system that could be resilient emerge with a digital layer connecting them all.
Mobility systems are like oil tankers. They're not really flexible, yet that is what these times demand. And you've actually done that by creating a social distancing filter.
So if you have that digital layer from the last question that seamlessly connects all the different mobility services in a region, which is what my company IAMOB does, we recruit and integrate the public and private services. We have our own algorithms that support multimodal journeys so that we can infinitely connect public and private services to each other for users so they can find the best way to go from A to B seamlessly. Okay, so if you have all of that digital layer of the mobility ecosystem enabled, then you can add additional capability to that digital layer to adapt to evolving trends in the world, whether it's autonomous shuttles or whether it's COVID or other issues around climate change or whatever that might be. You can actually dynamically, in some cases, change the variables of the ecosystem or the algorithm so that you have the outcomes that people in society need and want. So in the case of COVID, what you have is growing concern around the world around the safety of crowding together in, say, a public transit vehicle, yet continued concern about Carmageddon, which is, well, a lot of people are going to feel that the best way to resolve their concerns is to actually just take their own car. Well, we all know that's definitely not ideal for society, for our cities, for the planet. So what we need to do is ensure people can feel they can travel safely going between A and B, combining different modes of mobility. And in that case, what we've done is say we can we can get extra data about the different mobility services connected to IAMOB and filter that when a user chooses to say, give me the route that is most socially distant. So you can imagine this can include things like, of course, walking, micromobility like cycling, using active mobility corridors. We can factor in how crowded the public transit vehicle is and basically have like a yellow, orange, or red indicator. And if it's red, that is that it's, say, over 50% occupied. That vehicle or that line of train won't even be visible to a user if they've actually indicated social distant preference filter. There are other things we can factor in if we have the information. Some taxi and ride-hailing companies are doing better than others to try to ensure their vehicles are not contaminated and disinfected in between every time there's a new rider. So when we have that data, we can feed that in, and therefore it becomes part of the social distance filter.
In your book, Post-Capitalist Entrepreneurship, you talk about the role of government and government policy. Talking about these new parameters in mobility platforms, you're dealing with different data sources all of the time, some of them publicly available, some of them maybe government sources. How would you describe this relationship between public and private organizations?
That's a good question. There's a lot of debate in our industry, which is generally referred to as mobility on demand or mobility as a service, regarding what's the right relationship between the MOS platform, mobility as a service platform, and the government. And should it be the government that actually operates these? Should it be the private sector? Should there be a hybrid model and collaboration? And then, as you say, as you unpeel the layers of the onion, there's a lot of debate and discussion around what happens with data. What kind of data needs to be made available by the public sector? What kind of data should the public sector have a right to access from private mobility operators in the community? And how do we protect user data while getting access to anonymized aggregated data so that we can better improve that mobility ecosystem? So there's a lot of layers and a lot of debate and uncertainty around the responses to your question, really. But if you ask me, I think there's an important need for the local authorities and regional to be protagonists in a MOS deployment, but that they shouldn't be the only ones. I think we need to have an open marketplace for aggregating mobility experiences. I think public transit authorities and rail operators, say national ones, should be required by EU law to expose not just their time schedules, which most of them do already through something called a GTFS feed or something like it, in terms of enabling a third-party aggregator to know when the train stops where. That part's kind of already resolved for the most part, although there's no good proper database of all of these feeds around Europe. So companies like us have to go every city and get the data, but it's usually publicly available. But what's not usually publicly available, and there's still a lot of conflict about this, is around the public transit ticketing or rail ticketing capabilities. So one thing is to allow third parties like IAMOB, who are trying to solve the system level problems of mobility, to have access to the data about when the train is arriving, but can we sell a ticket for the train and make this system available to any client who wants it? So in our case, IAMOB, we don't go direct to the end user. We build the whole technology stack and we make it available to public entities. We work with transit authorities, we work with rail operators, but we're also working with insurance companies, energy companies, car manufacturers, and others who want to offer this kind of seamless mobility experience to their customers or their own employees even. So if you really want this seamless, resilient mobility ecosystem that increasingly is less dependent on private automobiles, then you need to make that whole system accessible to third parties, including the booking and payment capabilities, so that users can seamlessly, with one app, whichever app they like, get around cities and between cities and inside cities using one app. And then you'll start to see more and more migration, because one of the things people say a lot in our industry is that if you really want to remove car dependence, the first thing you have to do is make mobility as easy or easier and more affordable than owning your own car. You basically need to have a better user experience from the seamless mobility ecosystem access you have versus your own car, or you won't get out of your own car. So that's the challenge, and that's why we need collaboration between the public and private sectors.
Right now, there's a real sense of urgency, Boyd, and a lot of things that we didn't think or perceive were possible are now actually being done. Different mobility systems, making room for different forms of transport, and things like cycling in cities. When this crisis passes, in your opinion, what will remain?
I have two responses to that. One is, I don't think the mentality that we're seeing within cities will sustain the way we'd like it to. That extreme experimentation, design thinking, rapid prototyping, changing the urban fabric overnight. I don't think that will become a standard practice, even though we'd love it to be. But I think some of the changes that we're seeing in the way cities are particularly responding to transport-related challenges will become standard practice and not just be trials during the COVID crisis. I mean, we've seen some examples of this already. For example, Milan was one of the first cities to initially block something like 30 kilometers of city streets for enabling more active travel during COVID, so people could be more comfortable if they're walking or cycling outside, and therefore they took space away from the cars, which I think is what we've been advocating for as urbanists in Europe for a long time. Well, urbanists around the world have been advocating for it, but in Europe, we've been winning the battle. In other parts of the world, not so much. But the COVID has accelerated that trend of taking back streets and giving them back to the people. And I think that trend is going to continue, because Milan was the first to not just do it temporarily, but the first to actually say, you know what, this is a permanent change to our urban fabric. These 30 kilometers are never being recovered back for cars. They are now fully dedicated for active mobility. That's happening in a massive way in the United Kingdom right now, and it's happening really in different pockets around Europe and in some places around the world. So I think COVID has resulted in being an accelerant for particularly taking back space for more active mobility. Again, going back to the UK, where we have a really interesting activity with a rail client and others emerging in the UK, which is a really interesting. They're undergoing some interesting dynamic changes to their ecosystem. But one of the things is they had been resisting kick scooter sharing services in the UK. They were not legally allowed. And now, since COVID and directly because of COVID, they have specifically deployed at a national level trials of a whole range of kick scooter sharing services, where they've gone out to tender and offered trial licenses to many of the scooter companies. And I think those are going to be here to stay in the UK and beyond. So my answer is, the behavior that we're seeing cities engage in regarding embracing sort of real rapid innovation and trials, unfortunately, I don't think will be standard practice as just a way of doing business as a city or national government. But I do think the changes that we're seeing around mobility are probably going to be here to stay, and will maybe even just accelerate even after COVID, as it's proven to work. It's proven to drive more people out of cars and into more active mobility, which, as we know, is a benefit to everyone: society, congestion, contamination. So that part I'm optimistic about.
Thank you very much, Boyd, for taking the time to talk to us.